It was a quiet night in the small town of Millbrook. The streets were empty and the houses were dark. Suddenly, a scream pierced the silence. It was coming from the hospital. Dr. Johnson had just finished his shift when he heard the scream. He rushed towards the sound and found a nurse in the hallway, her eyes wide with fear. "What happened?" Dr. Johnson asked. "The patient in room 207, she said. He's not human anymore." Dr. Johnson's heart raced as he entered room 207. The patient, a man in his 40s, was convulsing on the bed. His eyes were bloodshot and his skin was pale. Dr. Johnson approached the patient cautiously and took his pulse. "His pulse is erratic," Dr. Johnson said to the nurse. "We need to call the CDC." As they made the call, the patient's body began to convulse violently. Suddenly, he sat up and let out a guttural scream. Dr. Johnson and the nurse backed away as the patient climbed off the bed and started towards them. "Stay back!" Dr. Johnson shouted, but the patient didn't listen. He lunged towards the nurse and sank his teeth into her arm. She screamed in agony as the patient tore into her flesh. Dr. Johnson grabbed a nearby chair and swung it at the patient, knocking him to the ground. He dragged the nurse out of the room and slammed the door shut. "What the hell is happening?" the nurse gasped. "I don't know," Dr. Johnson said, "but we need to get out of here." As they made their way through the hospital, they encountered more patients with the same symptoms. They were pale, feverish, and aggressive. Dr. Johnson and the nurse managed to fight them off, but they were outnumbered. "We need to get to the quarantine zone," Dr. Johnson said. "It's our only chance." They rushed towards the quarantine zone, but it was too late. The virus had spread throughout the hospital and there was no escape. Dr. Johnson and the nurse were trapped, surrounded by the infected. "What do we do?" the nurse asked, tears streaming down her face. "We wait," Dr. Johnson said. "We wait for a cure." Days turned into weeks, and the hospital was quarantined. The infected patients were quarantined and left to die, while the uninfected were left to fend for themselves. Dr. Johnson and the nurse struggled to survive, but they were eventually infected as well. As they lay dying, Dr. Johnson turned to the nurse and whispered, "I'm sorry. I couldn't save you." The nurse smiled weakly and said, "It's okay. You did your best." They closed their eyes and drifted off into eternal sleep, victims of a virus that had no cure. Days turned into weeks, and the hospital was quarantined. The infected patients were left to die, while the uninfected were left to fend for themselves. Dr. Johnson and the nurse struggled to survive, but they were eventually infected as well. As they lay dying, Dr. Johnson turned to the nurse and whispered, "I'm sorry. I couldn't save you." The nurse smiled weakly and said, "It's okay. You did your best." They closed their eyes and drifted off into eternal sleep, victims of a virus that had no cure. Days turned into months, and the hospital was abandoned. The virus had spread throughout the town, turning everyone into mindless, flesh-eating monsters. The town was a wasteland, a place of death and despair. One day, a group of survivors stumbled upon the hospital. They cautiously made their way inside, searching for supplies. As they searched the empty halls, they heard a faint moaning coming from one of the rooms. They approached the room and cautiously pushed open the door. Inside, they found Dr. Johnson and the nurse, their bodies decayed but still moving. They lunged towards the survivors, their eyes filled with hunger. "Shoot them!" one of the survivors shouted. "Shoot them now!" The survivors opened fire, and Dr. Johnson and the nurse fell to the ground, finally at rest. "We need to get out of here," one of the survivors said. "This place is cursed." As they made their way out of the hospital, they could hear the moaning of the infected echoing through the walls. They knew that they were not alone, and that the virus was still out there, waiting to claim its next victim. The survivors quickly made their way out of the hospital and into the town. Everywhere they looked, they saw the devastation the virus had wrought. Abandoned cars and buildings littered the streets, and the stench of death filled the air. "We have to find a way out of here," one of the survivors said. "We can't stay here." They searched for a way out of the town, but every road was blocked. They were trapped. "We have to find a way to survive," another survivor said. "We can't give up now." They searched for supplies and weapons, preparing for the inevitable battles they would face. The infected were everywhere, and they had to be ready. As they made their way through the town, they heard a faint sound in the distance. It was a helicopter, and it was getting closer. "Over here!" one of the survivors shouted, waving their arms. The helicopter landed in the town square, and a group of soldiers stepped out. They were from the CDC, and they had come to contain the virus. "We're here to help," one of the soldiers said. "We have a cure, and we can save you." The survivors breathed a sigh of relief. They had hope again. They were taken to a nearby military base, where they received the cure and were quarantined for a few weeks. When they were finally released, they stepped outside into a world that had changed. The virus had decimated the town, but there was hope for the future. The survivors were grateful to be alive, and they knew that they had to rebuild. It would be a long and difficult journey, but they were ready to face it together. The survivors walked through the deserted streets, searching for signs of life. Everywhere they looked, they saw the remnants of a once thriving community. "It's hard to believe that this was all caused by a virus," one of the survivors said. "I know," another replied, "it's like something out of a nightmare." As they walked, they heard a faint sound in the distance. It was music, and it was getting louder. "Where is that coming from?" one of the survivors asked. They followed the sound to a nearby park, where they found a group of survivors gathered around a campfire. They were playing music and singing, trying to hold on to some semblance of normalcy in a world that had gone mad. "Join us," one of the survivors said, "we have food and water." The survivors joined the group, sharing stories of their experiences and planning for the future. They knew that they had to stick together if they were going to survive. As they sat around the campfire, they heard a faint rustling in the bushes. They tensed, ready for a fight. Out of the bushes stepped a young girl, no more than 8 years old. She was dirty and scared, but alive. "I've been hiding," she said. "I saw your fire and I thought maybe you could help me." The survivors took her in, giving her food and water. They learned that she had lost her family to the virus and had been surviving on her own for weeks. "We'll take care of you," one of the survivors said. "You're not alone anymore." The survivors knew that they had a long road ahead of them, but they also knew that they had each other. They would rebuild their community, one step at a time, and they would never forget the lessons they had learned during the outbreak. They would always be ready for the next virus, the next disaster, the next challenge that life would throw their way. And they would face it together, with courage, strength, and hope. As they sat around the campfire, the survivors made a plan for the future. They would scavenge for supplies and fortify their camp. They would also search for other survivors and try to rebuild their community. "We need to stick together," one of the survivors said. "That's the only way we're going to survive." The group agreed, and they set out the next day to search for supplies. They found a few abandoned stores and warehouses, but most had already been looted. As they were about to give up, they heard a faint sound in the distance. It was a radio signal, and it was getting stronger. They followed the signal to an old radio tower on the outskirts of town. As they approached, they saw a small group of survivors gathered around a radio. "We've been broadcasting for weeks," one of the survivors said, trying to find other survivors. The group joined forces with the radio group, and together they were able to connect with other survivors across the country. They shared information and resources, and they learned that the virus had been contained in some areas. "We can rebuild," one of the survivors said. "We can start over." They worked together, building a new community from the ashes of the old. They created farms and schools, and they worked to bring a sense of normalcy back to their lives. Years passed, and the survivors grew old. The virus was nothing more than a distant memory, a reminder of the strength and resilience of the human spirit. As the survivors sat around the campfire one last time, they remembered the hardships they had faced and the triumphs they had achieved. "We did it," one of the survivors said. "We survived." The others nodded, grateful for the bonds they had formed and the lessons they had learned. They knew that they had been forever changed by the virus, but they also knew that they had emerged stronger and more resilient than ever before. As the survivors reminisced about their journey, they heard a sound in the distance. It was a helicopter, and it was getting closer. They rushed out of their camp and saw a military helicopter landing nearby. Soldiers in full gear emerged from the chopper, weapons at the ready. "We're here to evacuate survivors," the captain said. "You're the last ones in this area." The survivors looked at each other, unsure of what to do. "We've built a life here," one of the survivors said. "We don't want to leave." The captain nodded, understanding their reluctance to leave their community behind. "I understand," he said, "but there's a chance the virus could come back. We need to get you to safety." The survivors reluctantly agreed, gathering their belongings and boarding the helicopter. As they took off, they looked down at the community they had built and the memories they had made. "We'll be back," one of the survivors said. "We'll rebuild again." The others nodded, grateful for the chance to start over and make a new life for themselves. As the helicopter disappeared into the horizon, the survivors held on to the hope that they would one day return to their community and rebuild it stronger than ever before. They knew that they had the strength and resilience to overcome any obstacle that life would throw their way, and they were ready to face the future with courage and hope. Months passed, and the survivors were resettled in a new community. They worked hard to rebuild their lives, but they never forgot the lessons they had learned during the outbreak. One day, a group of survivors from their old community arrived at their doorstep. They had made the journey on foot, determined to reunite with their old friends. "We're back," one of the survivors said. "We couldn't stay away." The others smiled, tears in their eyes, grateful for the chance to reunite with their old friends. "We've missed you," one of the survivors said. The two communities came together, sharing stories and memories of their time together. They worked to rebuild their community, determined to make it even stronger than before. As they sat around a campfire, the survivors raised a toast to their fallen comrades and to the strength and resilience of the human spirit. "We've been through so much," one of the survivors said, "but we've come out on the other side, stronger and more united than ever." The others nodded in agreement, grateful for the chance to start over and to build a new community together. As they sat there, watching the flames dance in the darkness, they knew that they were ready for whatever challenges life would throw their way. They were survivors, and they were determined to make the most of their second chance at life.